This man spent his entire life training with the sword, from childhood all the way through his youth. He joined the royal security team and eventually rose to the rank of captain. But sadly, he was born without talent and could never become a true hero like his comrades. The captain was the only one who grew old and frail. As the years went by, he found himself just a few steps from death's door. But even as life faded from his body, the captain longed to swing his sword just one last time. And then, a miracle occurred. He reached the pinnacle of swordsmanship, becoming a sword saint. It was both a miracle and a cruel mockery of fate, because as soon as he achieved this lifelong dream, the venerable captain breathed his last. Of course, the story doesn't end there, because this captain is our main character. When he woke up again, he found himself in a strange house, and in a reflection from a mirror by the bed, he saw a face filled with youthful vigor. That's right, this was the legendary Reincarnation. The sword saint had been reborn in the body of a young boy. So, we should adjust how we refer to him to match his new age. He quickly realized he was in a castle within the EIS territory, the very place he'd worked during the last years of his previous life. The most important thing now was to figure out whose body this was. The sword saint, in the body of a child, began to wander around the castle. He came across a red-haired girl practicing with a sword. After carefully observing her technique, he could tell she was a promising talent, and the girl had already noticed him. "You're awake, Asher? Are you just going to stand there and watch? Or are you going to train?" So, that was his new name. Asher tilted his head in thought for a moment, then spoke up. "That's the Ravinia style of swordsmanship, isn't it? Judging by your swing, you've probably been training for at least 4 to 5 years, right? However, your footwork is still a bit off. You should loosen your wrist and slow down your swing." Asher said it all in one breath, expecting a word of thanks in return. But no, the red-haired girl threw her wooden sword straight at his face. Her expression was thunderous. "Hey, how dare you speak to me with that tone? I am your master. You will call me Lady Leica, got it?" Asher, bewildered, caught the sword and bowed his head in apology. He thought she was a friend, not his master. Talk about being clueless. With a memory that bad, it's a wonder he remembered how to breathe. Leica didn't press the issue of how he addressed her any further. But what made her more curious was why he, someone who never even touched a sword, had suddenly shown up at the training grounds. And on top of that, he was speaking as if he were an expert on the sword techniques of heroes. "If you know it so well, why don't you demonstrate it for me? If you can't, you're going to be in a world of trouble." Asher knew he had just poked the hornet's nest. If he'd known she was the lady of the castle, he never would have opened his mouth. But now, trying to play dumb would probably just earn him an even worse beating from Leica. Besides, Asher wanted to test his own abilities anyway. Even after being reincarnated, his sense for the sword felt as sharp as ever. What could it hurt? Asher slowly walked up to the wooden dummy. His stance took Leica by surprise. It was the fundamental stance of the Royal Swordsmanship style. "When did you learn that? You seem more serious than usual today." Asher found his young master somewhat amusing and thought to himself, "When did I learn it? I've been swinging a sword for over 70 years, little girl. In my last life, I swung this sword right up until my final breath." Asher raised his sword, then brought it down in one powerful slash. It was strange because he was only holding a wooden sword, yet it sent tremors throughout the entire training ground. Wielding the infinite sword style, Asher was incredibly pleased with this new, healthy body, brimming with youthful energy. Thanks to his excellent physical condition, Asher felt like his strikes were effortlessly light. He even felt as if he was about to take flight. Seeing Asher transform into a completely different person, Leica was so stunned she was speechless. By the time Asher calmed down, he had completely wrecked the training ground. It's true that he'd already lived one life, but the excitement of holding a sword was undeniable. "I apologize," Asher said, turning towards Leica. Looking at the current state of the training ground, he felt he should probably learn to hold back. But Leica wasn't paying any attention to that. What she was focused on was the royal swordsmanship that Asher had just displayed. It was the standard swordsmanship created by the Empire. The moves Asher just used were only the basics of the royal style, but their destructive power and speed were truly terrifying. Unable to contain her excitement, Leica grabbed his hand, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "Asher, you were so cool. You have an incredible gift. Why have you been hiding a talent like this for so long?" Being praised so lavishly by his master made Asher feel both embarrassed and shy. Just how lazy was the former owner of this body that a small demonstration like this would make Leica react this way? "You flatter me too much, my lady. It's just a minor talent. Asher shyly pulled his hand back. You're lying. Oh right. What was it you were telling me to do earlier? Something about swinging the sword slower? Before Asher could even answer, someone else appeared, cutting their conversation short. It was Leica's older brother, a man named Luke. He was clearly displeased to see Asher speaking with Leica, as if they were equals. Who gave you the nerve to speak directly to my sister, and with such an arrogant tone, no less? You piece of trash. You should remember your place. You're just a lowly commoner, and we are nobles. Asher was berated relentlessly, and could only bow his head low in apology. It seemed Luke was nothing like his younger sister. He was a truly arrogant young master. It didn't stop there. When Luke saw Asher holding Leica's sword, he became even more annoyed. He assumed that Asher was trying to secretly learn the royal swordsmanship. Leica tried to step in and explain, but Luke immediately shut her down. You should stay quiet, Leica. However, this is perfect timing. I was just in need of a training partner. With that, Luke drew his sword. But it wasn't a wooden one, it was a real, sharpened blade. If you're still standing after 1 minute, I will acknowledge you, Asher. Now, show me what you've got. Seeing how serious Luke was, Leica became extremely anxious. But he had no intention of stopping, only promising her that he would spare Asher's life. On the other side, Asher could only let out a long sigh. Luke looked down on him so much that he didn't even bother to assume a proper fighting stance. The more he thought about it, the more he couldn't understand how these two siblings could be so vastly different. Get ready, Asher, Luke roared and then charged forward. Leica couldn't see what happened next. All she knew was that when she came to her senses, Luke's sword had been knocked to the ground, and across his face was a long gash, bleeding nonstop. Asher's face went pale. Man, trying to lose on purpose was a lot harder than he thought. It also took Luke a few seconds to even realize he had been injured, and the one who had wounded him was none other than a mere servant. However, Luke was not the noble gentleman his appearance suggested. To be specific, he was the type to act like a king when he wins, but run crying to his daddy when he loses. Asher was bound hand and foot and brought before the lord of the EIC territory. Luke bluntly accused him of coming here to harm his master. Then, he begged his father to punish Asher severely. Asher, is what Luke is saying true? Lord Reberok asked, looking down coldly from his seat. Asher could recognize this man. In his past life, when he was first appointed as the captain of the guard, Reberok was still just a boy who used to follow the previous lord to visit the guards. That means 20 years have passed since the former lord's death. Seeing Asher remain silent, Reberok continued to speak. Asher, for the longest time, we have treated you like our own son. Despite your countless mistakes, we never threw you out. But this time, you've gone too far. Reberok had wanted to punish Asher severely, but out of consideration for their long history, he merely banished him from the territory. The lady of the house seemed to disagree, but Reberok refused to indulge an ungrateful brat any longer. Luke let out a gloating laugh, but just then, Leica appeared out of nowhere, shattering the tense atmosphere. My brother is the one at fault. Asher didn't do anything wrong. Father, please, let him go. Leica had changed her clothes and now looked incredibly serious and mature. She didn't hesitate to reveal the truth. Luke had injured himself while trying to swing his sword at Asher. Meanwhile, Asher was sincerely teaching her swordsmanship. Father, my brother's pathetic swordsmanship is the real disgrace to our family's noble name. Luke was furious, turning beet red that his own sister would criticize him just to protect a mere servant. Even Asher couldn't believe Leica would be so bold. The lord and his wife were taken aback as well. But what truly stunned them was Leica's claim that Asher was teaching her swordsmanship. This was the first he'd ever heard of it. But his beloved daughter, Leica, insisted that Asher was a master of advanced royal swordsmanship, so much so that she wished he could be her official instructor. Hearing this, Luke found it absolutely ridiculous. You seriously want to learn swordsmanship from Asher? The guy can't even hold a sword properly? And not only that, you want to learn that useless royal swordsmanship? Have you lost your mind, Leica? You claim you've seen Asher's swordsmanship with your own 2 eyes? If you don't believe me, then let him demonstrate his skills himself. Despite her young age, Leica was incredibly calm and resolute. Her demeanor convinced Lord Reberok that he had to test Asher for himself. He ordered his personal knight, Karen, to conduct the test. Asher, I don't know what tricks you used to suddenly learn royal swordsmanship and bewitch Leica, but if this is all just some kind of trick, you won't be leaving this place alive. He thought to himself that things had now spun completely out of Asher's control. But Asher had no choice. He had to pick up the sword and face Karen. The terms were simple. He had to last for 5 minutes against Karen. If he succeeded, the Lord would acknowledge his skill and pardon him. Karen, for his part, seemed to hold a great deal of animosity toward Asher. He couldn't stand the thought of a mere servant getting so full of himself and trying to charm the young lady. Therefore, even with Lady Benexia watching with a worried expression, he had no intention of holding back. Naturally, Karen was the first to attack. Asher parried his first strike. Lika watched with anticipation, hoping to see Asher hold his own against Karen, just as she had witnessed earlier. "You're trembling, aren't you, Asher? Did you really think swordsmanship was this easy? Let me teach you a lesson," Karen boomed. This was clearly not a fair fight. Asher was armed with only a wooden sword, while Karen wielded a real one. Karen attacked relentlessly, forcing Asher to struggle just to defend himself. Unleashing a storm of attacks, Karen grew more and more pleased with himself, gloating at his own technique. "Just as I thought. You're pathetic. How dare you insult the noble art of swordsmanship, you stubborn whelp model." Seeing Asher at a disadvantage, the crowd got incredibly excited. "That's amazing, Karen. He truly lives up to his reputation as the top graduate of the Royal Academy. He's truly worthy of his position as Knight Commander, coming from such a prestigious family of swordsmen." The Lord looked a little disappointed, thinking that facing Karen was a bit too much for Asher. But just then, he suddenly burst out laughing a fierce, menacing grin. Then, Asher began to stand up straight. "Karen, your swordsmanship. It's so cute. What do you mean by this?" Asher's blatant contempt made Karen's blood boil. "I'm just giving you back the same words you gave me. Did you really think the title of Knight Commander could be taken so lightly? Let me teach you a lesson." Then, Asher hadn't intended to show off so much, but Karen's attempt to show off in front of an expert was truly an eyesore. The moment he finished speaking, Asher launched a powerful counterattack. Karen couldn't even resist the blow and was sent flying backward. The Lord's entire family was shocked by this scene, but Karen was even more stunned. He had no idea how Asher had managed to send him flying like that. "I didn't even land a direct hit on you, and you still couldn't block it. How pathetic. Pick up your sword and get up, oh esteemed, elite swordsman." Asher's tone was filled with contempt. That's right. He truly despised this so-called top graduate and elite swordsman. It seemed that after peace was established, with no more demons or wars, the new generation had grown stagnant and weak. This left Asher utterly disappointed. He thought to himself that it was time to whip the army's discipline back into shape. "What's wrong, Karen? The head of the knights in the EAC territory, defeated so easily by a commoner?" The humiliation was immense. Karen, nearly driven mad, picked up his sword and staggered to his feet once more. He couldn't accept being defeated by a mere commoner. Karen's swordsmanship grew even more ruthless, but to Asher, his speed was still far too slow. He didn't even bother using his sword to fight back. Instead, he used his fists. Karen was beaten until he stumbled and fell flat on the ground. The more Asher looked at him, the more secondhand embarrassment he felt. Compared to the Karen of today, perhaps any soldier under his command in his past life was more skilled. They had undergone incredibly rigorous training, and yet, thousands, even tens or hundreds of thousands of them, had fallen helplessly before the demons. In this peaceful generation, with no more demons, the next generation should have been endlessly developing their swordsmanship. But the more he looked at Karen, the more disappointed he became. After he fell, Asher was surrounded by a group of other soldiers. Lord Reberov now shot him a glare that could almost pierce through his body. "Who are you? You're not the Asher we know. Who in the world are you?" Asher knew what that look and that question meant. Reberov was suspicious of him, but explaining that he'd been reincarnated was just absurd. So, amidst the chaos, Asher came up with an excuse. He had lost his memory. "When I woke up this morning, I realized I couldn't remember anything at all. I don't know who I am, and I certainly don't know who any of you are. The only thing I can remember is swordsmanship. I thought that if I picked up a sword, it might help me recover more of my memories. But my mind is a complete blank." What an actor. His performance was so realistic. After that, Asher dropped the sword in his hand and obediently knelt. "However, it is a fact that I injured the commander. I will accept any punishment." Faced with this situation, Lord Reberov ultimately decided not to blame him. Instead, he confined Asher to his room. "You are not allowed to step a foot outside this room until you have sorted out your chaotic thoughts and memories." That night, Leica brought him a piece of bread and a glass of milk. It seemed Asher wasn't the only one in turmoil. The young lady was also deep in thought. Truly, the Asher of today was like a completely different person. Just yesterday, he was a whole different man. He had never picked up a sword, and his words and behavior were crude and vulgar. He was, to be precise, a disgrace to this castle. However, The reason he was allowed to stay was because Lady Benezia had adopted Asher when he was a baby, even before Luke and Laika were born. At that time, Lady Benezia was heartbroken over her inability to have children. So, she raised Asher by herself, without the help of any servants, and poured all of her love into him. Later, Luke and Laika were born, and originally, Laika had always considered Asher her older brother. But their relationship was incredibly unstable. Lady Benezia even favored him over her own 2 biological children. Her affection for Asher was almost like an obsession, and despite her efforts, Asher only grew more distant. His sullen behavior and crude language caused outrage throughout the entire castle. Lord Reberok once tried to throw him out of the castle, but Lady Benezia cried her eyes out and pleaded with him not to. In the end, the Lord gave in to his wife and allowed him to stay. However, Asher's status changed from the Lord's adopted son to a servant. Luke always found him to be an eyesore and called him trash, while Laika always felt he was just a pitiful child. But today, he had suddenly changed. His way of speaking, his actions, his personality, everything was completely different. Even though Laika was just a child, she could sense that the current Asher was like a master swordsman. More than that, he was like someone who had trained for many years to reach this level. Lost in thought as she walked, Laika found herself in front of Asher's room before she knew it. She hesitated for a few seconds, then raised her hand to knock. "Asher, I've brought you some food." There was no answer, so Laika opened the door herself. But the moment the door swung open, the first thing Laika saw was a sword swinging down from Asher's hand. "Asher!" she screamed in terror, and the bread and milk on the tray clattered to the floor. Laika fell backward onto the ground in fear, and the sword in Asher's hand stopped instantly. I'm sorry. I saw a sword in the room and just wanted to practice a little." Laika was still trembling with fear. If Asher hadn't stopped in time just now, her head might have been split in 2. Afterwards, Laika stayed in Asher's room for a while to watch him practice. The more she watched, the more he seemed like a fanatic, obsessed with swordsmanship. As she was watching him, mesmerized, Asher suddenly spoke, startling her. "Lady Laika, what kind of person was I before? Both Master Luke and the Lord. I get the feeling they don't like me very much." Laika was a bit flustered, unsure if she should tell him or not. In the end, she decided to shorten it as much as possible, only saying that the old Asher was an ill-behaved child. And aside from Lady Benezia, no one in the castle liked him. The worst things he ever did were being violent towards the common people or destroying their property. Hearing this, Asher could only sigh. To do things that cross the line like that. Then, it makes sense that the entire castle hates me. So why are you still speaking to me so calmly, my lady? Shouldn't you look down on me? Asher continued to wonder. Why should I look down on you? Perhaps Laika was a kind and forgiving child, just like her mother. That's why she never hated Asher before, only pitied him, and now she felt that way even less. She wasn't even bothered by the fact that he had apparently lost his memory. What she cared about was that Acer's attitude was now much better. Laika truly wanted to be Acer's companion and grow together with him. Just then, a knock came from the door. It was Lady Benezia. Only now did Acer have a moment to get a good look at her. Benezia was a beautiful and incredibly gentle woman. He quickly knelt on one knee and bowed cautiously. "My lady, what brings you here?" Benezia sat down, reaching out to stroke Acer's cheek in a very natural gesture. "You don't need to address me like that. No matter what happened, I am still the one who raised you. So let's just be as we were before. Mother." Acer let the words slip out so naturally that Lady Benezia seemed quite surprised. "You've forgotten everything, so why can you still remember that I am your mother?" Acer didn't know why either, but he knew he was no longer the Acer the lady once knew. Benezia's affectionate gaze made him feel guilty for having taken over the body of the person she regarded as her own son. "I'm sorry, but your face, your name, I have forgotten it all. To me, you are just a stranger." His words were gentle, but they dealt a devastating blow. But even so, Lady Benezia pulled him into a hug and comforted him endlessly. Her voice was full of love, trembling slightly with emotion. Benezia remembered that she was the first person to see Acer. It was the year she had just turned 20, and she didn't have any children of her own. During that time, she was always living with a sense of guilt and self-doubt. But then Acer appeared, abandoned outside the castle walls. When the lady held Acer in her arms, his smile lit up her world. And despite the opposition from others, she poured all her love into this son. "Even if, to you, I am just a stranger now, it doesn't matter. Because you are still my son. I have vowed to love you as my own flesh and blood." At this moment, Acer's heart was in utter chaos. He couldn't understand why the former owner of this body had chosen to live such a pathetic life. How could he be so indifferent and heartless to the people who truly loved him? He couldn't explain it, but if the heavens had allowed him to be reborn in this body, then he decided he would write a different life for the name Acer. I understand, Mother. In stark contrast to the heartfelt reunion with Lady Benezia, Lord Reberok was currently having a major headache. He speculated that Acer's body had been possessed by a demi-demon, but he immediately dismissed this hypothesis himself, because demi-demons had disappeared a long time ago, and even if it really was a demon, its possession of Acer's body made no sense. It should have tried to take over the bodies of the king and the nobles to exploit their power. There was no reason for a demi-demon to target the body of a commoner, but he couldn't understand how a kid who had never learned swordsmanship could defeat a high-ranking knight like Karen. Not to mention, his intelligent daughter Leica was supporting Acer unconditionally. Your conversation is quite interesting. A strange voice rang out, making Reberok and his guards jump in shock. Out of nowhere, a strange, sword-wielding man was perched on the windowsill. He'd arrived without making a single sound, and Karen immediately attacked. But terrifyingly, the man easily blocked the sword with just 2 fingers. Not bad swordsmanship. Your fundamentals are quite solid. You've hired a decent guard, my lord. Karen was tossed aside, his face darkening with the humiliation of being defeated twice in a single day. But Lord Reberok had already regained his composure. He stood up, gave a standard bow, and paid his respects. It's been 20 years. Welcome to my home? The other man just sneered. Karen finally understood how that man could stop his sword with only 2 fingers. Because this was no ordinary man. This was the one who had reached the pinnacle of swordsmanship, the sword saint, Habon S. Thor. Habon's return after 20 years came as a complete shock to Reberok. After all, he had completely vanished following the war 20 years prior. Many people even assumed he had died somewhere along the way. Heh, I just had some business to take care of. Habon found a corner and sat down. I traveled to the other side of the continent, and then to the very ends of the world. Even so, I still couldn't find the answer I was looking for. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say Habon was looking for our captain, but the captain has become Arthur now. After some brief small talk, Habon grew curious about the child who had defeated the domain's top knight. The lord didn't dare hide anything and was forced to tell Habon the whole story. He was fascinated by the story, convinced that the child was a peerless genius. Little did he know, it was his old comrade. The next day, Arthur was indeed practicing swordsmanship with Leica. The day before, she had decided to become his disciple. Although Arthur had tried to refuse due to their class difference, she had been so insistent that he could no longer shirk the responsibility. Today was their first training session. Arthur noticed Leica was quite talented, her techniques were good, but the problem was her lack of physical strength. Even though Arthur wasn't holding a sword and had stressed that Leica should attack him as if she held a deep-seated grudge, she was still easily caught by his bare hands. Her movements, both for offense and defense, were full of openings. Arthur ruthlessly threw her to the ground. Then he'd help her up again. Talk about tough love. My lady, you are strong, but only when it comes to performance swordsmanship. Real combat is a different story. In his past life, Arthur had seen countless so-called geniuses die tragically on the battlefield. That was the price they paid for overestimating their own abilities. As for this noble lady, Arthur felt it was better for her to train her body and mind before learning swordsmanship. You always talk like some old veteran who's seen war. Just who are you? Leica demanded, attacking him relentlessly. I'm merely telling you the basics you need to become a skilled swordsman. She was too slow for Arthur. He dodged her blade with a simple sidestep before easily overpowering her. But the things you're teaching me have nothing to do with swordsmanship. Leica began to doubt this teacher of hers, but even so, Arthur was determined to stick to his own curriculum. He made Leica return to the fundamentals, instead of blindly clinging to her faith in sword techniques. Simply mastering sword techniques wouldn't be enough for her to survive a real battle. My lady, what you truly need is to learn the practical application of swordsmanship and how to control yourself. You must remain cold and composed in front of your opponent. Arthur picked up the wooden sword and started to demonstrate. He wanted his young student to ensure she could swing her sword with flexibility, then overwhelm her opponent with sheer power. Although Leica was reluctant to admit it, the truth was that no matter how many times Arthur swung his sword, she couldn't find a single flaw in his form. From now on, I will teach you practical combat skills to complement your swordsmanship. Let's do it. Let's train. Leica charged forward eagerly. The two of them trained from early morning until sunset. By the time Leica returned, she felt like her arms were about to fall off. Arthur put her through a hellish training course, paying no mind to the fact that Leica was a noble lady. However, she could genuinely feel herself growing stronger after just one session. So it seemed the effort she put in today wasn't a waste at all. On her way back to her room, Leica ran into Luke. He didn't look too pleased. "You've been out playing with that Arthur fellow again, haven't you?" "Playing? We were practicing our swordsmanship." "Practicing what? With a lowly commoner?" The more he spoke, the darker Luke's gaze became. He had found his sister's recent behavior extremely distasteful, believing she was tarnishing the reputation of the nobility. Because she was a prestigious lady, she couldn't possibly learn the sword from a commoner. Leica had no intention of paying any mind to her clueless brother. But Luke's repeated insults towards Arthur made her incredibly annoyed. Leica pointed her sword straight at her brother's face. "If you talked a little less, would people think you're mute? Are you going to hit me?" Luke panicked slightly. "You can't hit me. I'm the rightful heir to this domain." Seeing Luke flustered and clumsy didn't improve Leica's mood in the slightest. Suddenly, a hearty laugh broke the tense atmosphere between the siblings. "Ha ha, a little sister daring to strike her older brother. Now that's a rare sight." Leica turned her head and saw her father walking with an unfamiliar man. Reborov was extremely embarrassed that Haiban had witnessed this disgraceful scene. He quickly walked over and sternly reprimanded his daughter. Leica bowed her head, mumbling an apology. But her gaze was now focused on the man walking beside her father. She could sense that this man's status was anything but ordinary. But Luke was quicker to recognize him. He bowed his head and obediently greeted him. "Sword Saint Haiban, I am Luke Hanvark, the rightful heir of the Hanvark family." Leica was astonished. Sword Saint was the highest rank a swordsman could achieve. Those who reached this level were always respected by everyone. But in the continent's history, fewer than 10 people had ever become a sword saint. After his sycophantic greeting, Luke bluntly expressed his desire to become Haiban's disciple. He wanted to use this opportunity to show off to his sister that only a sword saint was worthy of teaching him swordsmanship. But unexpectedly, Haiban didn't even spare him a glance and walked straight over to Leica. "Hello, young lady. A pleasure to meet you." Leica was a bit surprised. But Haiban felt that this girl showed no fear standing before a sword saint like himself. In fact, she was in a state of readiness, prepared to fight the moment he made a move. Seeing Leica like this, Haiban really wanted to test her a little. And so, he drew the sword from his back, much to the alarm of Reborov and Luke. In that instant, Leica remembered what Arthur had taught her this morning. Never let the opponent's aura overwhelm you. If she let that happen and swung her sword on instinct, she would surely lose. Calmness is the key to victory in any battle. And so, facing Haiban's action, Leica simply raised her wooden sword calmly to block. "Impressive," Haiban chuckled. This wasn't the first time he'd seen children with potential and approached them to see their reaction. But usually, they would just scatter, frightened by his aura, or they wouldn't be able to withstand a single blow. But Leica was different. This little girl stood her ground, and even used a wooden sword to block his attack. Looking at Leica, Haiban could say with absolute certainty that she would become a swordmaster in the future. Not stopping there, Leica used all her strength to knock Haiban's sword away. Then she began to attack. The sword saint could see her technique, her movements as fluid as a snake. This led him to believe that the girl was a student at Ravenia's swordsmanship academy. Naturally, all of Leica's attacks were easily blocked by Haiban. But he couldn't help but give the girl a sincere compliment. "You've got good skills, kid." Leica was knocked to the ground by Haiban. His blade was pointed right at her, and though it held no killing intent, it still terrified the Lord. Haiban turned his head and nodded at Reborok. Unlike that cowardly son of his, he had a brave and strong daughter. Gritting his teeth in anger, if the sword saint was saying this, then it was highly likely his sister would be taken as his disciple. Indeed, Haiban wanted to take Leica as his disciple, but before he could even say a word, he was met with a kick from her. Leica quickly picked up her sword and got into a battle stance, but Haiban had vanished. Before she knew it, he had circled behind her and easily placed a hand on top of her head. "So you even know how to sneak attack me when my guard is down?" His tone clearly held no hint of blame. "If you're given enough time to grow, your swordsmanship could definitely rival Ravenia's." Haiban couldn't stop smiling and asked Leica to take him to the person who had taught her swordsmanship. After confirming that the man before her was the real sword saint, Leica agreed. However, while sitting in the carriage, she still felt a bit of hostility towards Haiban. It was because he had parried her full power strike as easily as if he were playing with a child. This deeply wounded Leica's pride. And even Lord Reborok, who was usually hot-tempered, was now acting humbly when speaking with Haiban. This made Leica feel that he was even more unapproachable. "Hey kid, Your name is Lekka, right? Haiban's voice broke Lekka from her wandering thoughts. Ah, yes. About that friend you mentioned who taught you swordsmanship. What do you feel when you watch him practice? The moment Arthur was mentioned, Lekka became much more talkative. She thought for a moment, then carefully explained her feelings. Lekka felt that Arthur's sword swings were incredibly proficient, with no flaws to speak of. It was as if he himself were a seasoned swordsman. The more Haiban listened, the more intrigued he became. Oh? An 18-year-old kid with the experience of a swordsman? The three of them stopped in front of the training ground. As soon as he saw this yard, Haiban couldn't help but sigh with emotion. I've had many duels here with my brother in arms. Oh, so where is that friend of yours now, sir? He was a wonderful friend. It's just a shame that he left us 20 years ago. The Lord, realizing his slip of the tongue, could only mumble his condolences to Haiban. But Lekka paid no attention to the two of them, as she had already spotted Arthur practicing his swordsmanship intently in the yard. Lekka quickly ran forward. Seeing her appear, Arthur stopped what he was doing. However, he seemed to freeze when he saw the tall figure behind her. It was Haiban, his comrade, whom he hadn't seen in so long. However, Arthur was now just a kid, not yet 18, and a commoner at that. So, he suppressed his surprise and gave a proper bow to the sword saint. I've been wanting to meet you for a while now, kid, Haiban chuckled softly, his hand then moving to the sword on his back. Arthur smiled to himself. Haiban's habit of wanting to test the skills of young talents hadn't changed one bit. But it had also been a long time since he'd fought Haiban, so Arthur decided to make the first move. His technique and speed made the sword saint freeze for a few seconds. He began to reminisce about many years ago, when the captain of the Royal Guard was still here. The two of them were the closest of brothers. And now, he saw the shadow of his old comrade in this young boy. The captain of the guard, Haben, pondered for a long moment before uttering a few words. But those few words alone were enough to make Arthur break out in a cold sweat. Lord Haben, what did you just say? The Lord thought he had misheard. Never mind. It's nothing, Haben replied nonchalantly before flying back toward Arthur. His gaze made the boy incredibly tense. Arthur was afraid that Haben had discovered his true identity, but his next question made the boy let out a sigh of relief. Kid, are you perhaps his disciple? Arthur silently thanked the heavens. That made sense. Who would ever believe in reincarnation, anyway? Instead, thinking the way Haben did was much more normal. I don't know who you're referring to, sir. I don't have a master. Is that so? Haben broke into a smile, his mouth stretching from ear to ear. In that case, how about you become my disciple? Arthur was astonished, but Lord Rebarak was even more so. But before he could even open his mouth to answer Haban's question, Lyca's cold voice rang out. Hold on a minute. I don't know if you're a sword saint or whatever, but what kind of behavior is it to just attack people like that? Lyca was extremely annoyed to see Haben carelessly swinging his sword at anyone and everyone, but her disrespectful tone was enough to shave several years off her father's life. Haben didn't blame her. Since he had been gone for 20 years, it was only natural that the current younger generation wouldn't know of him. Kid, allow me to show you who I really am. Haben raised the sword in his hand. The sky seemed to darken as a whirlwind gathered around him. Arthur knew what this was. This was aura, a characteristic that only a sword saint possessed. When a sword saint unleashes their aura, their power is released to its absolute maximum. The Haben now looked completely different from his usual playful self. Once he had gathered enough power, Haben swung his sword in a clean, decisive slash. And with just that one move, he shattered a massive boulder far in the distance. The aftershock was so powerful that Lyca almost lost her footing. Even Lord Rebarak was witnessing Haban's true power for the first time since peace had been established. I am the sword saint. Haben slowly enunciated each word. With that talent of yours, you could achieve great things in the future. So what do you say, kid? Do you want to become my disciple? Although Rebarak didn't care for Arthur, he felt the boy should absolutely not pass up this opportunity. The very title of Disciple of the Sword Saint was enough to command respect from anyone. It had also been a long time since Arthur had last seen Haban's power, and he knew he was as strong as ever. After the aftershock of the aura passed, Arthur calmly spoke 2 words. I refuse. The 3 people at the scene were frozen, stiff by his words. For the first time in history, a child had refused the chance to become the Sword Saint's disciple. Outside, the townspeople had also heard that the Sword Saint Haben had arrived. And so, they began to flock and surround the castle. Model. Any swordsman would dream of becoming his disciple. Amidst the chaos, Karen could only turn them away, claiming that the Sword Saint Haben had already found a successor. In stark contrast to the chaos outside, Haiban was taking it easy inside the castle. He had nowhere else to go, so he decided to plant himself there and keep trying to convince Arthur. "Hey, you really don't want to be my disciple?" No means no. Arthur flatly refused once again. Haiban, constantly clinging to him and wanting to take him as a disciple, was giving Arthur a massive headache. Leica found it incredibly annoying that whenever and wherever Arthur was, Haiban was there too. To Arthur, becoming the disciple of his own good friend was an absolutely ridiculous idea. There was no way he could agree, but he couldn't reveal the real reason for his refusal either. Arthur wanted Haiban to take Leica as his disciple instead, but in reality, the man had already asked her for her opinion, and Leica had refused, saying she already had a master. Arthur felt like these two were giving him a double headache. He couldn't believe Leica was willing to turn down the chance to be a sword saint's disciple just to learn swordsmanship from him. It seemed this girl's admiration and loyalty to him were even greater than he had imagined. However, in contrast to them, there was someone else in a terrible mood. That would be the young lord, Luke. Haiban's words kept digging into his mind. Being called a coward by the sword saint had deeply wounded Luke, and he decided to drown his sorrows in alcohol. He irrationally decided to pin all the blame on Arthur. "It's all that bastard's fault. He needs to disappear. He's the one who made my life this miserable," Luke mumbled as he staggered along, completely drunk. But he never expected that going out for a drink tonight would lead to a major turning point in his life. As Luke stumbled forward, he was suddenly enveloped by a thick, black smoke. The bottle in his hand fell and shattered. Luke tried to wave the black mist away, but it was no use, and he was eventually swallowed by it. When Luke woke up, he had been taken to a strange and desolate place. Before him stood an eccentric figure with a bizarre face. No matter how you looked at him, he screamed, "Bad guy." The heir to the domain, Luke Vance, a pleasure to meet you. Another new day passed, and Arthur was still diligently practicing his swordsmanship as usual. Leica was also there, that sharp tongue of hers constantly bad-mouthing Haiban. "He's a sword saint, after all. You should show him a little respect, Leica." "But you don't respect him either, do you, Arthur?" Arthur didn't know how to explain it to her. How could he tell her that he was actually an old man who had also reached the level of a sword saint, and that Haiban was his good friend? Arthur still tried to persuade Leica to go and learn from Haiban, because he was the one who had mastered the heroic swordsmanship that she wanted to achieve. But Leica flatly refused, saying she wanted to become more like Arthur. She truly respected him and considered him her master. This made Arthur question his own existence a little. In his past life, he truly had no talent for swordsmanship. All the sword styles in this world were created by the heroes of the past. Every swordsman learns heroic swordsmanship, hoping to surpass human limits just like them. But Arthur was different. He chose to follow the path of royal swordsmanship. This was a basic sword style, created by the Empire that anyone could learn. It was also the only sword style Arthur could learn in his previous life. Just like that, he spent his entire life holding a sword, dedicating himself solely to royal swordsmanship. Now, Arthur couldn't understand why a talented kid like Leica respected someone like him so much. Of course, this girl had her own thoughts that he couldn't possibly guess. To Leica, Arthur was the one who had made her stronger. Without you, she wouldn't have been able to handle the pressure from Haiban during their first meeting. Arthur's unconventional guidance and teaching helped her immensely. From that moment on, you became Leica's guiding light, and she swore she would only stick with you as her master. What's this? Are the lovebirds having a little spat? As usual, Haiban showed up today with that smug, punchable look on his face. His little joke made Leica's face turn as red as a ripe tomato. "Stop joking around. What's that in your hand, Sir Haiban?" "Heh, heh. It's a gift for you." In Haiban's hand was a pair of gauntlets. You don't focus on any weapon other than the sword, but you can use many different types of weapons, can't you? Haiban's soul-piercing gaze left Arthur with no way to deny it. The royal swordsmanship you learned was meant to build a foundation. It's an uncomplicated and practical fighting style. Unlike heroic swordsmanship, which is built on profound principles and superhuman techniques. However, what sets royal swordsmanship apart from heroic swordsmanship is that it's applicable to many different weapons, not just the sword. In his past life, Arthur had also used many other types of weapons, as he had to utilize every skill he had to survive harsh battles. What Haiban brought him was a pair of iron gauntlets. Arthur tried them on. They felt a bit heavier than normal gloves. Haiban, seeming to understand his thoughts, started laughing that irritating "huh-huh" again. "Those aren't ordinary gauntlets, you know. Try channeling your power into your hands and imagining any weapon you want." Arthur closed his eyes, did as Haiban instructed, and imagined a dagger. Immediately after, a real dagger appeared in his hand. Leica couldn't help but let out a gasp, and Arthur himself was also very surprised. These gauntlets are a spatial magic tool. They're essentially a weapon storage. You can take out or put in any weapon you want. This is truly useful for me. But it would be useless for swordsmen who can only use one type of weapon that suits them. Why did you make something like this? I didn't make it for myself. I made it for a friend. Although, he ended up dying before he could receive it. Haiban's words sent Arthur into a somber silence. Is it the friend from 20 years ago that you mentioned before? Driven by curiosity, Leica took the initiative to speak to Haiban first. That's right, he also used royal swordsmanship. Even though we walked different paths, I really admired that man. He acknowledged his own lack of talent and never stopped striving. To calmly walk one's own path is also a form of enlightenment. Haiban didn't hesitate to express his deep respect for that friend. This only made Arthur feel even more empty. In his past life, he had always kept his distance from Haiban, believing that someone as untalented as himself would be of no value to the heroes. He never expected that Haiban had paid so much attention to him, even going to the trouble of creating this item specifically for him. Arthur, you're really just like my friend. Haiban's voice pulled Arthur back to reality, from your way of speaking, your straightforward actions, and your eyes. Even your sword stance is exactly the same. That's why I really want to take you on as my disciple. What do you say? Have you reconsidered? Leica was speechless. It was the first time she'd ever met such a persistent sword saint. This time, Arthur didn't refuse anymore. He agreed to become Haiban's disciple, but only temporarily. And of course, he would continue to teach Leica using his own methods. Haiban was extremely pleased with his decision. Afterward, Arthur pulled another weapon from the gauntlets. Now then, shall we have a match? All right. The two of them immediately charged into a duel, just like they had so many years ago. Leica could also see a subtle shift in Arthur's emotions after receiving that gift. Honestly, she was also quite happy that Arthur now had a famous master, so no one could look down on him anymore. Meanwhile, back to Luke. He had been kidnapped by the Motarua Assassins Guild. This was the world's largest assassins guild, which had appeared 50 years ago. The moment Luke heard that name, he became extremely tense. He grew even more tense when the eccentric man said they wanted to ask the young lord of the domain for permission to set up shop here. This is the first time I've ever seen an assassin's guild that operates in the shadows politely ask the landlord for permission. Suddenly, Luke thought of something. He calmed down and stood up straight with a dignified air. Fine, I will permit you to operate here, but on one condition. All right, speak. Arthur, I want you to help me finish him off. Meanwhile, the battle between Arthur and Haiban showed no signs of ending. Haiban was stunned to find that the boy's fundamental combat skills were on par with his own, his movements honed to perfection. But overall, Haiban still had a slight edge. After all, Arthur had absolutely no talent for heroic swordsmanship. Oh, it seems you've gotten used to those gloves, haven't you? Haiban chuckled after catching the dagger Arthur had thrown. Yes, that's why you told me to master these little tricks, isn't it? Haiban couldn't stop nodding. In a real fight, Arthur couldn't unleash the overwhelming power of heroic swordsmanship using only royal swordsmanship. Therefore, using magic to compensate for the limitations of royal swordsmanship like this was incredibly useful. Arthur made no secret of how pleased he was with these gloves. From then on, Arthur began training every day under the strict regimen Haiban set for him to get accustomed to the gloves. Of course, he continued to teach Leica at the same time. But she was a constant source of worry for Arthur, because in terms of talent, Leica far surpassed him. Her insistence on learning only from him made Arthur fear that he was limiting her potential for growth. As for Haiban, he increasingly felt that Arthur resembled his old friend, right down to the very stoicism he practiced. However, he never would have imagined in his wildest dreams that Arthur was that friend. At every opportunity, he would tell Arthur stories about that friend. You're a lot like him, you know? He only ever learned royal swordsmanship. He was a desperate man who always thought he had no talent. To be honest, we all used to think he was talentless too. As he said this, Haiban's tone suddenly grew somber. But now, I don't know what a person's true talent really is anymore. Arthur was momentarily stunned. He never expected Haiban to say something like that. The Haiban he knew was a man who had absolute faith in his own talent. He always saw his great skill as a blessing. What on earth could have happened to an arrogant man like Haiban to make him lose so much confidence in just a few years? Just as Arthur was about to speak, Leica appeared and interrupted their conversation. She had come to announce that the fiefdom had distinguished guests from the empire. Upon hearing this, Haiban clicked his tongue, looking completely fed up. They finally tracked me down here. What a bunch of troublemakers. The so-called distinguished guests from the Empire were a squad of royal knights. They were here because the Emperor was summoning Haiban. Even though he was a sword saint revered by thousands, he had no desire to defy the Emperor's command. Fine. I was planning on leaving anyway. We'll set out tomorrow. It's already late today. The knights were ecstatic that they had persuaded Haiban so easily. Before retiring for the night, Haiban didn't forget to bid farewell to the Lord and his daughter for their warm hospitality over the past few days. That night, Arthur had a dream about Ravinia. Unlike Haiban, she never considered him a friend. She had once advised Arthur to choose a different path instead of becoming a swordsman because he had no talent. But as you know, Arthur resolutely followed the path of the sword and, by the end of his life, broke through to become a sword saint. Yet, back then, Ravinia had insisted that Arthur would never achieve anything in his entire life. At best, he would only become a third-rate swordsman. This was truly the most terrible nightmare Arthur had ever had. Ravinia was a swordsmanship genius and the youngest sword saint. She had once said Arthur would never achieve anything, but he did something no one ever expected. Moreover, he was now guiding a child who could potentially reach the same heights she did. The more he thought about it, the more agitated Arthur felt. He decided to get up and practice his swordsmanship, only to be spotted by Haiban. Training so late? I had a nightmare and couldn't sleep. What about you? I'll be leaving at dawn. We won't be seeing each other for a while, my disciple. Haiban confessed that he had been wandering the world for the past 20 years, seeking to understand the contradictions and changing experiences of this world. He had never found an answer, but after meeting him, Haiban felt he had finally found one. For some reason, Arthur felt that Haiban was strange today. He was exuding an oppressive and bloodthirsty aura. After speaking, Haiban reached for the sword on his back. Arthur. How wrong I was about everything I believed in. Just a moment later, Haiban's blade swung down, cold and merciless. Arthur stood frozen, not even trying to dodge, but in the end, he was completely unharmed. What a relief. Haiban hadn't been attacking him at all. His targets were the creatures lurking behind Arthur's back. When Arthur turned around, even he was stunned by the sight before him. Beneath Haiban's blade, dozens of demons had been slain. These wretched things had been relentlessly pursuing them, lurking from the shadows. But why were they here? The more Arthur thought about it, the less he understood. These dark creatures were supposed to have been banished from the world by the hero 20 years ago. He himself had been a direct participant in that war, which made the current situation even more unbelievable. But a look of sorrow crossed Haiban's face. That was, indeed, what the history books said. But it was all a lie. The truth was, the Demon King and his forces had never vanished. They had been following Haiban all this time to eliminate him and bury the truth forever. Just like right now, after that one strike from Haiban, even more demons began to converge on their location. It had been a long time since Arthur had seen demons, and seeing them swarming together like this made his stomach churn. Their immediate objective was to take care of this entire horde. As someone with actual combat experience, Arthur fought with absolute confidence. The gauntlets Haiban had given him proved to be incredibly useful. The weapon in his hand transformed fluidly, further enhancing Arthur's combat prowess. Haiban wasn't idle either. He fought the demons while covertly observing his disciple. Watching Arthur in a real battle today, Haiban finally believed that Lika's words were true. Arthur's movements and his method of attack were undeniably the skills of a battle-hardened veteran. The resemblance to the captain of the Royal Security Division was unmistakable. Haiban didn't even consider the possibility that his friend had been reincarnated, but he was certain that Arthur was no ordinary child. The curiosity and affection he felt for Arthur grew ever stronger. It was as if he wanted to make up for his past regrets with his old friend, through Arthur. After some time, the two of them had dealt with all the monsters. Haiban didn't hesitate to tell Arthur what had been on his mind for the last few days. The reason he'd been sticking so close to the boy was because he suspected Arthur was a demon. Perhaps he was a demon who had mimicked a child's form after devouring its memories. But after this battle, that thought had been completely dismissed. Because a demon could never imitate human swordsmanship so flawlessly. Arthur, you truly resemble my friend who passed away. Haiban sheathed his sword. Dawn was about to break. He had to get to the Empire and reveal the truth that the demons still existed to warn everyone of the lurking danger. After that, he wanted to set out in search of that missing warrior. Arthur, I hope we meet again someday. Next time, I want to have a much longer talk with you. Haiban's sorrowful smile weighed heavily on Arthur's mind. That morning, he didn't practice his swordsmanship as usual. Instead, he just lay in bed to rest. He began to wonder, back then, had the heroes really failed to defeat the Demon King? 20 years ago, alongside the heroes, there was another brilliant figure known as the warrior. When the world was drowning in a sea of blood under the Demon King's rule, it was this warrior who appeared like a shining star and swept the demons away. He was an absolutely powerful individual, like a hero straight out of a fairy tale. However, after the battle 20 years ago, he vanished just like Haiban, abandoning the land and the people he ruled over. No one knew where the warrior had gone. And Arthur was no exception. But if he had failed to destroy the Demon King, then how could one explain the peace the world had enjoyed for so long? Arthur felt a complex mix of emotions. He felt he had been reincarnated because his mission was still unfinished. Whether he uncovered the secret or not, whether the truth was ever brought to light, he still had to hold his sword tight and fight. To clear his head of these rambling thoughts, Arthur decided to leave his room. Just a few steps outside, he ran into Luke. Today, that guy wasn't throwing a fit or trying to start a fight. He just handed Arthur a piece of paper. On the paper was Luke's order. Arthur was to go to the alleyway, written on it, and he was to be on time. Of course, he wasn't up to any good, because right at that moment, the Motorua Assassins Guild was plotting Arthur's demise. Their leader seemed uneasy after hearing he was the Sword Saint's disciple and wanted to take care of him personally. But the masked freak overruled Luke, insisting on handling it himself. He claimed Arthur was just some talentless brat who only knew royal swordsmanship, making him an easy target. This kid is dangerous. He's on a completely different level. The leader of Motorua shook his head repeatedly. Remember this, the first time we revealed ourselves to the world, it was someone who only knew royal swordsmanship that pushed us to the brink of annihilation. Don't you ever forget that. That was because our organization was weak back then. Things are different now. Enough talk. Let him fall by my hand today. As the successor to the warrior's legacy, I won't be defeated by something as pathetic as royal swordsmanship. In the end, the leader of Motorua still let the masked man go after Arthur himself. And Arthur, right on schedule, followed Luke's orders to a T. The moment he entered the alley, he could already sense the presence of his enemies. Along with that masked freak were 3 other assassins. Arthur recognized them instantly. Motorua. I wonder what business you all have with a lowly person like me. Arthur's unnaturally calm attitude took the assassins by surprise. They couldn't understand how he knew who they were. Only the masked man burst out laughing. How interesting. Did the Sword Saint tell you about us, you little brat? I know enough. Of course, Arthur knew all too well. Because the master of royal swordsmanship, their leader had mentioned, the one who drove Motorua into the shadows, was him. In his past life, these very assassins had set up shop in this territory, and he was the one who found and destroyed their base. Of course, these assassins had no idea Arthur was that person. They just saw that he practiced the same royal swordsmanship, and coupled with Luke's request, that was enough to make him an eyesore. You've got some nerve, coming here to find your own grave. Ha ha. A grave? Arthur felt as if he'd just heard the world's funniest joke. In a flash, he drew his sword, cutting down an assassin who was trying to ambush him from behind. You lot are just as chatty as ever, even after being sliced into 100 pieces by royal swordsmanship, aren't you? His actions and words sent a shiver down the assassin's spines. Even the arrogant masked man couldn't hide his shock. How could you possibly know about that? That's not important. What's important is that I only have one target. Seeing Arthur firmly gripping his sword, it was clear the Motorua assassins were in for a world of pain. Meanwhile, his good friend and master, Ivan, had returned to the kingdom. Upon entering the palace, he went for an immediate audience with the emperor, although Ivan's way of greeting was quite unique. It's been over 20 years, hasn't it? You seemed quite intelligent back then. But now, you're just an old man, crushed by the weight of reality. If anyone else had dared to speak like that, they would have been beheaded long ago. But Ivan was different. He walked the path of the heroic sword. To him, worldly power was meaningless. Therefore, even if Ivan were even more disrespectful, the emperor couldn't say a thing. And just as expected, the emperor didn't rebuke Ivan in the slightest, instead getting straight to the point. I've heard the rumors. The rift has opened, and the demi-demons have returned. What are you getting at? In truth, this was the very reason Ivan had returned. He wanted to borrow the empire's power to find the warrior's whereabouts. But the emperor said that this would be no easy task. The empire was laughably short on manpower, and that warrior wasn't the only one who had vanished. Meanwhile, in a dark alley, Arthur was still facing off against the assassins. The masked man relentlessly threatened him, demanding to know how he knew about their past. However, his swordsmanship was on a completely different level than these grunts. Coupled with those high-quality gloves, dealing with them was like bullying chicks. In a flash, the entire group of assassins was taken down, leaving only the eccentric masked man. Even so, he remained arrogant and showed no fear. Are you resorting to a desperate, pathetic struggle? It seems you've hidden a weapon in your cloak, haven't you? What a stupid question. Arthur realized his opponent had no idea he was using spatial magic to store his weapons. But it doesn't matter. This is the end of the line for you. You're about to fall to my great swordsmanship. The masked man slowly drew his sword. From my experience reading these stories, guys who talk this much before a fight tend to die pretty quickly. I wonder if this villain will even make it past the next 5 chapters. It had been quite a while since Arthur had seen the Motorola swordsmanship again. In contrast to the powerful and heroic hero swordsmanship, the Motorola style was like a venomous snake. This style conceals its form, moving through the shadows to strike at vital points. The masked man seemed very confident in his abilities, but coincidentally, so was Arthur. However, it seemed he was in for a bit more of a struggle this time compared to his previous life, because something strange happened. Arthur couldn't predict his opponent's attacks, even though he was all too familiar with the Motorola style from his past life. Seeing Arthur struggle, his opponent became even more aggressive. Finally, he succeeded in knocking the sword right out of his hand. You're a stupid, stubborn brat, but you do have some talent. But it's a shame you ran into me, one of the 13 honorary elites, recognized by leader Motorola. Still clinging to that honorary elite title? How pathetic. Why is Motorola targeting me? The bastard didn't want to say, but since he thought Arthur had no chance of survival, he reluctantly revealed the truth. Even without a direct order, Motorola's objective in the EAC territory was to eliminate Arthur. They were doing it because the Prophet had commanded it. Does that satisfy your curiosity before you die? More than I could have hoped for. Arthur laughed as a new weapon suddenly appeared in his hand. With blinding speed, he plunged it into his opponent's chest. Let me tell you a little secret. That pathetic swordsmanship of yours could never defeat me. It turns out he was just faking it to pry information out of his opponent. A man who is both powerful and cunning. Poor Luke was back at the castle, leisurely drinking wine. He was overjoyed, assuming that Arthur was 6 feet under by now. But before the wine could even take effect, Arthur had returned. His sudden appearance startled Luke so much that he dropped his wine glass on the floor. Arthur, why are you here? I'm here because I have a few questions for you. Luke looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Seeing Arthur completely unharmed made his heart sink even further. Not in his wildest dreams did Luke think Arthur could defeat the Motorola assassins and return. Moreover, from the look on his face, he was 99% sure that Arthur was here to settle the score. Arthur slowly advanced. Luke was so terrified he fell to the floor, scrambling backward with every step Arthur took. Finally, his back hit the wall. There was absolutely no way to escape. Don't you come near me. How dare you enter a noble's room, you insolent lowlife. Although it was still an insult, Luke's voice was trembling with fear. His current state was utterly unworthy of the title noble. Arthur raised his sword and brought it down with force. Luke's blood-curdling scream echoed throughout the room. Of course, he wasn't foolish enough to take the life of the castle's young master. Therefore, Arthur's sword only carved a gash into the wall, right next to Luke's neck, merely to intimidate him. Young master, until now, I have been able to overlook your unreasonable actions. But this time, you have gone too far. He was so scared his teeth were chattering, and he couldn't even manage to utter a complete plea for mercy. I hope you will not disturb my peaceful life with such actions again. This is the last time I will let this slide, young Master Luke. At that moment, Arthur's gaze was sharper than the sword in his hand. This was a serious warning, not just a simple threat. Even long after he had left the room, Luke remained sitting there, stunned. It seemed Arthur's scolding had completely traumatized him. Elsewhere, the sole surviving assassin from the confrontation with Arthur had returned to his base. Naturally, he didn't dare delay for a second, immediately reporting his failure. As expected, defeated by the Royal Swordsmanship, just like before, the leader of Motorola fell into deep thought. He began to doubt Arthur's identity and the connection between him and the captain of the Royal Security team. Just then, the sound of hurried footsteps approached, followed by a crisp laugh. You really think there's a connection between that kid and the former captain of the Royal Guard? Just because he also uses Royal Swordsmanship, the famed Motorola can't even handle a single brat. How pathetic. It was unclear who this powerful newcomer was to so brazenly insult Motorola right in front of their leader. And yet, the leader didn't say a single word in rebuttal. Very well. I will handle that brat myself with the great power of the god Marwin. The next day, as soon as the sun rose, the townspeople gathered in large crowds on the streets. The reason was the bodies of the assassins from the previous night. Rumors spread that this group of assassins had intentionally targeted the young master of the domain, Luke, and that the Sword Saint's disciple, Arthur, was the one who defeated them. His drastic change left many people utterly bewildered. Karen also came personally to inspect the scene, and after returning to Lord Rebarok, she reported her suspicions. I believe they are assassins from Motorua, my lord. Rebarok was extremely troubled. He never thought that notorious assassins guild would set foot in his territory. This meant his domain was under threat, and his own precious son was the one who had caused this whole mess. Rebarok wanted to summon his son, but since yesterday, Luke had locked himself in his room, refusing to eat or drink. The servants couldn't bear to see his pitifully miserable state. Rebarok also wanted to ground his noble son for a while, since Luke was the succeeding lord. He wanted him to reflect on his own actions after causing such a dangerous incident for the domain. As for Arthur, although Rebarok had never liked him, he still wanted to thank him for this incident. However, even though the Holy See had confirmed that Arthur was not possessed by a demon, both Rebarok and Karen were convinced that he was a dangerous individual. Arthur's sudden and abnormally powerful change made Rebarok feel threatened. He feared that if Arthur used that power for his own ambitions, the entire city of EAC could be destroyed in an instant. However, looking at it from another perspective, having someone as skilled as Arthur for support was an opportunity one could only wish for. Rebarok wanted to use this chance to observe Arthur's attitude, to be certain whether he was truly on his side or just a deceitful fraud. How do you plan to test him? Karen asked with a serious expression. But for a long time afterward, Rebarok did not answer. In reality, however, Arthur couldn't care less about this issue. The only thing on his mind right now was the true objective of that Motorua group. Although Arthur had interrogated him thoroughly the night before, the only information he received was that their orders were to kill him at all costs. So they had been gathering information everywhere and found their way here to make their move on him. A name suddenly popped into Arthur's head. The Motorola Assassins Guild worships a god named Marwin. Its top-ranking assassins, who hold positions as honored elites, receive power directly from this god. They've expanded their influence by using the god's power. That's why Motorola is so brazen and acts so openly. The thing is, Arthur had already wiped out the entire Motorola organization in the past. For them to suddenly come after him after 20 years of silence. Could it be because Marwin knows he was reincarnated as a child? Arthur mulled it over and felt he should return to the imperial capital, the place where he truly belonged. Perhaps someone there could explain the secret of his reincarnation. A knock on the door interrupted Arthur's thoughts. It was Laika, and she didn't look good. And something was indeed wrong. Before Arthur could even ask, Laika spoke up. Arthur, I've received a proposal for an arranged marriage. The proposal came from her biological father, Lord Rebarov. At first, Laika strongly objected, as she wasn't ready for marriage. However, her protests were useless since Rebarov was a lord, after all. Overwhelmed with sadness, Laika went to Arthur to pour her heart out. She felt as if her father had sold her off to some young master from a prestigious family, and in fact, her marriage partner had already been decided. Laika was to marry into the family of the Count of Belatria. Hearing that name, Arthur seemed to recall a certain face. Vanbaka Belatria. He was someone Arthur had known in his previous life. He wasn't particularly prominent or talented, but Arthur was certain that he was a virtuous lord who governed his territory very well. For that reason, the people of Belatria hailed him as a hero. The man was a good person, but he was over 50 years old, while Laika wasn't even 18 yet. So, with a concerned look, Arthur asked for clarification. Lord Belatria proposed to you? Is he insane? Laika practically jumped up. Not him, his son. How could I possibly marry someone that old? How troublesome. Vanbaka's son was also someone Arthur knew. His name was Boris. In his past life, Vanbaka had brought Boris, who was just a little kid back then, to meet him. The boy had also been very fond of swordsmanship, but Arthur found it incredibly strange. Because that lord had once firmly stated that he would let his son marry for love, regardless of whether she was a noble or a commoner, rather than forcing him into an arranged marriage. Indeed, in Arthur's memory, Vanbaka wasn't a rigid aristocrat. He was very humble, never condescending, and most importantly, he had very progressive views. But now, Boris was being forced to marry Laika. Could it be that even a man like Vanbaka had to succumb to the nobility's abuse of power? By the way, I heard. Laika suddenly said, breaking the silence. about how you took care of those assassins. I wish I could be as strong as you. It's a shame that now, I'm not even allowed to hold a sword. You're actually very talented, my lady. It's a real shame that you have to leave." These words came straight from Arthur's heart. When her master, Arthur, finally acknowledged her skills, Leica felt a bittersweet mix of joy and sorrow. And so, she made one last request to her teacher before her wedding. She wanted to have one final duel with Arthur. "This will be the last time I get to hold a sword before I become a lady. So give it your all. Don't you dare go easy on me." Seeing Leica so full of life, Arthur suddenly felt it was a terrible waste of her talent. The two quickly launched into a one-sided match. They fought from morning until the sun was high overhead, by which point Leica was completely out of breath. Casting aside any semblance of a noble lady, she tossed her sword aside and collapsed onto the ground. The hem of a pristine white dress entered her line of sight. As soon as she looked up, Leica saw the sad face of Lady Benezia. "Oh, my poor daughter." Benezia dropped to the ground, took Leica's hand, and began to sob. "Why are you more upset than I am, mother? You also had an arranged marriage, but you're living just fine. Your father and I already knew each other beforehand. But you haven't even met this man once." For over 10 years, Leica had been doted on and lived a carefree life. Lady Benezia truly couldn't bear to marry her daughter off to such a distant place. Therefore, she humbled herself and made a request of Arthur. She wanted him to personally escort Leica to the Belaturia region for her official introduction. Arthur agreed immediately, without the slightest hesitation. Besides, he wanted to see Vanbaka Belaturia again to find out how he was doing. The next day, dressed in a beautiful gown, Leica gracefully boarded the carriage. However, besides Arthur, who was entrusted by Lady Benezia, Karen was also on this trip. She didn't understand why her father insisted on sending a knight who held a grudge against Arthur along with them. Of course, as her father, Rebarak had his own reasons. He sent Karen to keep an eye on Arthur. He believed that Arthur's true target had always been Leica. Rebarak figured that, aside from Lady Benezia, Leica was the only one in the territory who trusted and protected Arthur. Therefore, if he married Leica off to a distant land, Arthur would soon reveal his hatred and true ambitions. At first, Karen didn't really believe it, but the more he thought about it, the idea that Arthur had changed just to win the young lady's affection started to seem quite plausible. Just thinking about it made Karen grind his teeth in anger on his lord's behalf. This despicable bastard. If he tries anything with the young lady, I'll chop his head off instantly, he thought to himself. Arthur was also aware of the lord's suspicion towards him, so he just sat in silence, showing no reaction. The carriage moved slowly, and a bored Leica gazed out the window. How much longer until we get there? Karen estimated they would reach Belaturia Castle in about half a day. "Oh," Leica exclaimed, "that's not too far, is it? It's surprising that two territories so close have no contact. The Belaturia territory has been isolated from the outside world for 20 years, my lady." The number 20 years made Arthur even more pensive, while Leica's curiosity was still not satisfied. Karen had no choice but to play host to her endless stream of questions. So, how did an ordinary man like the Lord of Belaturia come to be revered as a hero? Because back then, he was like a saint who had descended to earth, a noble, completely unlike any other. Karen began to speak at length about Vanbaka Belaturia. He was born into an outstanding family, that of a count. Being born with a silver spoon in his mouth could have guaranteed Vanbaka a life as a respected nobleman. However, when he grew up, Vanbaka wanted to travel the world instead. And through those journeys, he came to understand the hardships his people faced. After that, Vanbaka decided to renounce his life as a noble count and become the lord of a poor region, dedicating himself to caring for the sick and infirm. He even dismantled his own castle, selling off all his jewels and treasures. He used the money to help the starving, and the people living in the Belaturia territory were taxed very lightly. Lord Vanbaka even took up farming himself. The people, in awe of his noble deeds, hailed him as a hero. Even though he possessed none of the power of a knight or a Rivania, it's no small feat for a nobleman to live like that. He must have been a truly special person, Leica mused. Yes, indeed. Under his rule, Belaturia became a land known as paradise. There were no robberies, and certainly no killings, my lady. Listening to him, you'd think this Karen guy was hired as Lord Vanbaka's hype man. He's been going on and on without taking a breath, and he doesn't even seem tired. However, a moment later, the driver's panicked scream echoed through the air. Bandits. Sir Knight, we're being robbed. It was a terrible sight. Their carriage was now completely surrounded by a group of people. Karen drew his sword, and Leica wanted to help him deal with the bandits. but the long, flowing dress she was wearing was hardly suitable for the situation. Arthur pushed her back down into her seat. Please, just stay here, will you? I'm going. Why? I'm not so weak I'd lose to a bunch of bandits. This isn't about strength, it's about mentality. You've never taken a life, have you? With just one simple question, Arthur struck at the heart of the matter. Laika stopped insisting on fighting, but then she stepped out of the carriage and drew her sword anyway. A million questions raced through Arthur's mind, but the biggest one was, were these bandits also sent by Motor Hour? However, the sight that greeted him as he stepped out of the carriage left Arthur stunned. Looking closer, he realized they weren't bandits at all. They were just peasants, trembling as they clutched crude, makeshift weapons. Give us money, please. Or food would be fine, too. Stand back. This is the carriage of Lord Reberov, of the E.A.C. Take one more step, and I won't hesitate to strike. Karen coldly pointed his sword at the group of people. Stand down, Karen. In the end, Arthur had to intervene, sheathing his own sword as he stopped him. Because these people were just starving farmers. Arthur untied the coin purse from his hip and tossed it towards the crowd. It was filled with gold coins. Take this and go buy something to eat. After receiving the money, the crowd chirped their thanks and, without needing to be told twice, they turned and fled for their lives, likely driven by extreme hunger. Karen couldn't believe Arthur had been so generous. After all, that was his own personal money. Arthur, on the other hand, wasn't too concerned about the money. What troubled him was the direction the farmers had fled from. It seemed they had come from the Belaturia region. But hadn't Karen just said it was a paradise? Why would people flee their paradise, only to end up here, begging for food in such a wretched state? Karen's face suddenly went pale, though it was unclear what he was so worried about. Meanwhile, Laika, having grown impatient from waiting in the carriage for so long, finally got out as well. What on earth happened? Arthur quickly explained the situation to her, and the three of them returned to the carriage. Laika was clearly displeased that troublemakers had appeared right on the border between the two territories. Karen, for his part, still had that same pale expression on his face, and Arthur was once again lost in thought. He couldn't imagine what Van Baca was doing to his domain for its people to end up in such a state. The carriage continued on its way. At last, they arrived at the heart of the Belaturia territory. Upon their arrival, even Karen was stunned, because the residence of this region's lord was a colossal castle. It was even larger than Reberov's castle. Laika shot him a look filled with suspicion. Didn't they say, Lord Belatoria dismantled the castle with his own hands and sold his wealth to save his people? Karen didn't know how to explain it, because he himself was completely bewildered by the situation. Not long after, someone came out to greet them. It was Boros Belatoria, Laika's fiancé. He looked rather haggard and sad as the three of them boarded Boros's carriage. As they traveled, Arthur couldn't help but look around. The Belatoria domain had truly changed so much. The beautiful, peaceful villages had all turned into slums. The once happy people were now hollow-cheeked and pitifully desperate. Laika was even more shocked. The image of the paradise of Belatoria she held in her heart shattered in an instant. Seemingly understanding the feelings of those in the carriage, Boros took the initiative to speak first. Some criminals have appeared recently, so I ask that you please avoid contact with the villagers, milady. The three of them were led into the castle, where a lavish dinner party was held to welcome them. Looking at the sumptuous dishes before her, Laika despised this place even more. What paradise? This was clearly a slum, a den of thieves, wasn't it? How could they throw such a lavish party while the people outside were dying of hunger and disease? She was so disgusted she couldn't swallow a single bite, and Karen's emotions were just as complicated. Because after 20 years, this was no longer the Belatoria he knew. A short while later, Boros returned to the dining hall. He had come to invite Laika to meet his father, Lord Van Baca. Karen took this opportunity to try and speak, but Boros cut him off. Sir Knight, I know what you're about to say. Belatoria is different now. It's best if you don't expect anything, because my father is now no different than a monster. The man was now so obese, he looked like he might break the throne he was sitting on. He acted as if he was afraid people didn't realize he was drunk. Even while receiving esteemed guests, Van Baca never stopped chugging wine. This rudeness utterly disgusted Karen and Laika, and Arthur was even more disturbed. Facing this version of Van Baca, he felt a mix of shock, disappointment, and regret. After the hollow initial greetings, Van Baca downed another glass of wine. His gaze fell upon Laika's beautiful face. Oh, you must be tired from your long journey. What's your name? Laika Reberok, milord. Although Laika was utterly disgusted by this man, she still had to answer his question respectfully. Vanbaka let out another "oh," then stuck out his bright red tongue to lick the wine still clinging to his lips. His vile action filled Leica with both disgust and fear. Vanbaka's eyes darted about. It was clear he was up to no good. Leica, what a beautiful name. That night, Boros came to inform Leica that she would be sleeping in Lord Vanbaka's room. This was utterly absurd. How could a guest possibly sleep in the Lord's bed? Leica immediately refused, but Boros claimed that, because of her noble status, she had to sleep in the most precious room in the palace. After he left, Leica couldn't shake her suspicion. She was certain that this father-son duo was plotting something. And indeed, there was a plot. But it was unfair to Boros, as he knew nothing about it either. It turned out that arranging Leica's sleeping quarters like this was all Vanbaka's idea. He didn't even bother to hide it from his son, bluntly stating that he wanted to take Leica as his concubine. Even Boros was stunned by this revelation. He truly couldn't believe his father had sunk to such a level of depravity. Meanwhile, Karen and Arthur, who couldn't stand each other, were assigned to share a room. Karen was currently devastated, seeing the hero Vanbaka, who was once revered by the people, become so corrupt. Arthur's mood wasn't any better than his. The Varnbaka Bellatoria you know is an incredibly humble and courteous man. This domain was also once a beautiful, prosperous place. But now, that very same Varnbaka has devoured that paradise with his own bottomless greed. Now, Arthur no longer found it strange that their carriage had been stopped in the middle of the road. For a man so debauched, drowning in wine and women, it was only natural that his people would suffer in poverty and misery. While the two were lost in thought, a knock suddenly echoed from the door. It was Boros. My apologies for the disturbance, Sir Karen and Arthur, but I have something I must discuss with you. Hearing Boros's story, Karen was so enraged that he snapped the table in front of him in two. Boros was also deeply ashamed of his own father. His engagement to Leica had been called off. Instead, Lord Varnbaka would be taking her as a concubine. Furious, Karen immediately stormed out of the room. As a loyal vassal to Lord Reberok, he couldn't just stand by and watch his lord's daughter be used as a plaything by some old man. Arthur worried that Karen's anger would lead him to do something rash. He was about to chase after him, but was stopped by Boros. It's all right, Sir Arthur. You are also a loyal knight. I understand how you feel. From the very beginning, no one ever wants a political marriage, do they? With her natural talent in swordsmanship, she was always meant to walk the path to its pinnacle, wasn't she? Boros's words were light, but they made Arthur raise his guard significantly. How do you know about that? Boros didn't hide anything. He frankly admitted that he had his own intelligence organization, and this had brought him some information about the A.C. territory. The reason Varnbaka completely isolated this land was to prevent any information from leaking out. That's why Boros secretly established an underground organization specializing in gathering intelligence from the surrounding areas. From them, he learned that Lord Reberok had not sold his daughter for personal gain. It was just that. Varnbaka is a hero. Of course, even though he has no real talent, if the people hail him as a hero, then he is a hero. This made it difficult for Reberok to refuse the old man's marriage proposal. My father forced me to lure Leica into his bedchamber, which put me in a very difficult position. So I left her in the hallway. I have a secret passage behind the castle. At dawn, get her out of here immediately. Unlike his father, Boros seemed to be a genuinely good person. He was willing to let Leica go and accept any consequences from his father. But before Boros left, Arthur had more questions. He wanted to know what on earth had happened to this place. Boros hesitated for a few seconds, then began his story. Varnbaka changed completely 20 years ago. He became cruel, exploited the people, levied all sorts of taxes, and even blatantly stole the harvests the people had gathered. He used those resources to build his palace. Meanwhile, the common people had to live in misery and hardship. The streets were littered with the bodies of those who had starved to death. And Varnbaka, he was relaxing in his palace, enjoying fine wine and beautiful women. But why? He was once called a living saint for the love he showed his people. A saint? Ha! Boros let out a few self-deprecating laughs. My father once told me, son, you must marry the one you love most. But 5 years later, I fell deeply in love with a commoner girl and brought her home to meet him. Just 1 day later, she was executed. Asher felt a chill run down his spine just hearing it. That's right, Varnbaka had that wicked woman executed for the crime of greedily eyeing a noble's fortune. Even though he was just retelling an old story, Boros was still trembling with rage. Lord Boros, I will help you become the master of this place. Trust me, I will not let you down. Asher's answer was completely beyond Boros's imagination. When he turned back around, the boy had already vanished. Asher sought out Varnbaka, who was still lost in a drunken stupor. The old man seemed surprised to see Asher suddenly appear before him. He fiddled with the bottle of wine Varnbaka was drinking, his expression incredibly complex. 43-year-old Behemothian wine. Truly a rare bottle. But the Lord Varnbaka I know rarely drinks, especially not expensive wine. He's refused my offers every single time. You insolent brat. Do you have any idea who you're standing in front of? Asher didn't answer, instead asking, Varnbaka, tell me, what is the oath of the Bellatoria clan? What's that? What the hell are you talking about? Varnbaka answered without a second thought, and Asher felt like he'd been struck by lightning. He immediately drew a dagger from his glove and lunged forward aggressively. You're not Varnbaka. The drunken man was suddenly sobered by Asher's action, but before the old man could even react, the air was already filled with the stench of blood. Meanwhile, Karen had frantically found Laika and wanted to get her out of the castle immediately. Karen got her onto the carriage first, but Laika was determined not to leave because she couldn't see Asher anywhere. Just then, the soldiers began to shout urgent news to one another. Someone had attacked the Lord. The entire castle was thrown into chaos, and Boris panicked. By the time they burst into the room where Varnbaka's scream had come from, it was already too late. The old man was slumped on the floor, a deep wound in his chest, bleeding profusely. Beside him stood Asher, holding a blood-stained dagger. Father! Boris cried out in horror. This is not your father. It's an entity that possesses a human body and steals their appearance. It's a demon. Boris's face darkened. Meanwhile, all the soldiers had pointed their weapons at Asher. You mean a doppelganger? You're mistaken, Asher. Do you think I'm so foolish that I can't tell the difference between a human and a demon? If my father were attacked by a doppelganger, he would have lost all his memories and attacked me. But he still remembers everything. It's just that his personality has changed over time. Boris's body trembled uncontrollably as he spoke. Truthfully, Varnbaka was now no different from a monster. But even so, that old man was still his biological father. Boris had never given up hope that one day he would come to his senses. And the fact that Asher had finished him off sent Boris into a terrible rage. He immediately ordered his soldiers to attack Asher. But just then, Varnbaka, who seemed to be dead, suddenly let out a grotesque laugh. Everyone present in the room froze. So, you've found me out, Varnbaka. No, to be precise. The demon spoke. You are all so foolish. The transformation began. Varnbaka had truly transformed into a monster before their very eyes. All the soldiers recoiled in fear. Boris, on the other hand, was frozen in place, unable to believe what was happening right before his eyes. Meanwhile, Karen was rushing over. He was afraid that Arthur's reckless actions would shatter the friendly relations between their two domains. However, before he could even charge into the room, several soldiers were sent flying out. Inside the room, the demon was lording its power over Boris. It seemed the young lord still couldn't accept the fact that his father had died 20 years ago. Seeing him in this state, the monster was absolutely delighted. It didn't even try to deny that it had taken the life of his father. And even the fiancé Boris had brought home 5 years prior. Based on the situation, even Boris's own life was now in danger. Run, Lord Boris! Karen charged in at that exact moment, positioning himself between Boris and the demon. But his opponent seemed incredibly strong. It casually caught Karen's sword with just one hand. The two of them began a completely one-sided battle. While Karen was giving it his all, the demon looked completely at ease. You have some decent skills, but it's not enough. I don't have time to play around with you. Karen's sword was shattered, and he himself was sent flying with a single kick from the demon. Only then did the demon focus on the main issue. The person who had discovered its true identity. Kid, how did you figure out who I really am? The oath of the Bellatoria clan. He always carried it in his heart. He was always talking about it, and about the faith he placed in his people. Arthur growled, if you know nothing about Varnbaka, then don't you dare pretend to be him. The demon remained completely unfazed. Its entire clan had once been massacred. That had forced it to hide very carefully within human society. It even shamelessly recounted how, in order to perfectly impersonate Varnbaka, it had to read the diary he left behind. For the past 20 years, not a single person had discovered its secret. And yet, Arthur had only been here for a single day, and he'd already exposed it. Before you go meet your maker, answer me one thing. Who are you, kid? The Imperial Sword Saint. Arthur uttered the words, neither quickly nor slowly. Huh? The demon looked a bit bewildered, not understanding what Arthur was saying. I've already told you. You're kind. was wiped off this continent by a human, the Imperial Sword Saint. I thought I had exterminated all of you back then, but it looks like one of you managed to survive. Arthur's expression showed he wasn't joking in the slightest. This terrified the demon. The hand that was gripping Arthur's head immediately let go. It seems having its clan annihilated by him had left a horrifying impression on the demon. And so, after hearing what Arthur said, its first instinct was to flee. However, Arthur wasn't about to give it that chance. With a single slash of his sword, he cut the monster in two. It's been a while, hasn't it? Doppelganger. A little while later, Boris finally came to. The first person he saw was Arthur. As for the demon, it had already been finished off by him. It seems its motive was to avenge its race for what had happened in the past. Boris was a mess of conflicting emotions. But mostly, he couldn't understand how Arthur possessed such immense power. Leica rushed over at that moment, horrified to see Karen so severely injured. Karen was taken by Boris's soldiers to be treated. Because of this, the three of them had to stay in the Belaturia territory for a while longer. Not long after, a grave was erected for Lord von Bacca. It was the result of their best efforts to restore his body as much as possible. Arthur offered Boris his belated condolences, but it seemed the new lord wasn't completely devastated. It is heartbreaking, but I was deceived into joining hands with a demon, bringing this territory to ruin. It's all because I failed to recognize my own father. I'm glad you were able to save this place. Thank you, Arthur. Boris had become the new lord of the territory. He would have to rebuild Belaturia from scratch, just like his father. Speaking of Van Bacca, perhaps the one who was more heartbroken at that moment was Arthur. He remembered him once saying that he had nothing to his name but the title of Lord. Belaturia only existed when its people could live happily. He never felt that he was ruling over them, but merely supporting them. Von Bacca found happiness in his people's well-being, believing it was the duty of a nobleman. For such a good man to have met such a tragic end. This left Arthur, who had been close to Von Bacca in his past life, feeling utterly devastated. After a long silence, Boris spoke up again. He was deeply troubled by the fact that Arthur had used the Belaturia family oath to expose the demon. Not that it was a bad thing, but that oath is a secret known only to members of the family and their closest retainers. I have to ask, how did you know it, Arthur? And what's more, how do you know so much about demons? Arthur didn't know how to begin. Because his current existence was like a supernatural phenomenon, it would be very difficult for anyone to believe his story of reincarnation. Meanwhile, Karen had regained consciousness, and he told Leica everything about the demon. The truth, though painful, brought them a sense of peace. At least Von Bacca had never truly been corrupted. The turmoil in Belaturia and the whole political marriage scheme. It was all the work of that damned demon. Thankfully, the engagement had been called off. Besides, Boris never wanted to get married anyway, and now he had the authority to make that choice. Back with Arthur, he had come up with the most suitable answer to Boris's question. Because I am the disciple of the Sword, Saint Haiban. Boris no longer had any doubts about Arthur's identity. After all, Sword Saint Haiban had been one of his father's closest friends. Then, Boris suddenly dropped to one knee, bowing respectfully before Arthur. He was a bit startled to see a nobleman bow to a commoner. But this was Boris's most sincere expression of gratitude to the benefactor who had saved his territory. Arthur, as a token of my gratitude, if there is anything you desire, I will do everything in my power to grant it as the leader of Belaturia. Arthur smiled, relieved. He could sense that Boris was just like his father. He inherited Van Bacca's best qualities, even that gentle smile. Since the tragedy, Arthur believed that one day, Boris would also become a great lord, just like his father. Afterward, the three of them returned to their own territory. Without delay, Karen reported what had happened in Belaturia to Rebarok. There's been too much chaos lately. First, there was the incident with the Motorola Assassins Guild, and now this business with the demons. Finally, Rebarok understood why Hailban had said a crisis was brewing across the entire continent. Moreover, he officially acknowledged Arthur after the boy had helped him numerous times. Karen, I don't think we need to be wary of him anymore. Arthur, who was just outside the door, overheard everything. He was incredibly grateful that Lord Rebarok no longer viewed him with suspicion. After all, losing his memory and changing completely overnight made him no different from a doppelganger. But after everything, Rebarok chose to trust him. In any case, Arthur hoped that his remaining days in the castle would pass peacefully. He had no interest in the Rebarok family's power, nor did he have any desire to stay here for long. Arthur stood by the window, his gaze sweeping over the territory one more time. It was as if he was unwinding, savoring this brief moment of peace after a difficult journey. But he hadn't been relaxing for long before he sensed someone watching him. "Hey, come on out. You plan on hiding in there forever?" From the shadows, a stranger emerged. "You sound like an old man. I've heard that story before, kid." No. I should say the Sword Saint's disciple, shouldn't I? Fortunately, this person was not hostile to him. His name was Cairo, captain of the Topics intelligence team, which served Lord Boris. Before Arthur left, Boris had said he wanted to repay him. Therefore, he had requested the right to use this intelligence team. Although Cairo's appearance was rather villain-like, it seemed he wasn't Arthur's enemy. "Your skills are pretty impressive. The way you took down that doppelganger with a single sword strike was actually quite frightening. I didn't even notice you were there when it happened." Cairo took that as a compliment. After all, as the longtime captain of an intelligence unit, he was used to staying hidden. "Looks like that doppelganger knew something about you, huh? You've got sharp ears. But it doesn't really matter. So, what do you want with our intelligence agency? Surely you're not just looking for a lost puppy, are you?" Of course, Arthur wasn't that idle. What he wanted was to find the whereabouts of the heroes. 20 years ago, they all vanished, just like Hailban. Or the ones who were still around had become twisted, like Van Baka. This led Arthur to a hypothesis. Besides Van Baka, whose body was taken over by a doppelganger, he believed the others were all being hunted by the demons. Now, the continent was in danger due to the return of the demons. This spurred him to find the whereabouts of the remaining heroes, no matter what. Especially the young warrior who struck down the Demon King with his sword and drove the demons from this world. Cairo was a bit bewildered. He hadn't expected the task Arthur wanted him to do to be so monumental. But for the pride of the Topics intelligence team, Cairo couldn't refuse this mission. "There's no information on this continent that we can't find. Just you wait. We will find the information you need." After leaving, Cairo found a corner to sit and wallow in regret. His pride had made him accept the mission, but in reality, it was an incredibly tough assignment. This continent is so vast, and the events happened 20 years ago. Finding any trace of the heroes is like searching for a needle in a haystack. He decided to start his investigation in the imperial capital. What an arrogant brat. It seems he'll become a tough opponent to deal with in the future. After Boros became the new lord, he reopened the Bellatoria territory. This took many merchants by surprise, as the territory had been isolated for 2 decades. On a merchant carriage, 2 young traders were chatting with each other. They'd heard a rumor that a demon was the reason Bellatoria had been isolated for 20 years, but this made the white-haired old man sitting next to them scoff. "Get your facts straight. The demons were wiped out more than 50 years ago. You must have been alive back then to know that, huh? What did the demons even look like?" "We've never seen one." The old man thought for a moment, then began his tale. The demon race were huge, hideous creatures, possessing terrifying power. They could tear a human apart with ease. That's why so many people had to die before that final battle. Even he himself, just a child back then, nearly lost his life while fleeing with his mother. But they were saved by the heroes. You young folks should learn to appreciate the heroes. Without them, this world wouldn't be so peaceful. While the 3 of them were talking, they had no idea they were already being targeted by demons. Just as the old man was going on about how the appearance of demons was baseless, their carriage was ambushed by 3 of them. Meanwhile, at REINCARNATES Castle, Leica seemed to have returned to her daily routine. Today, as usual, she went out to the courtyard for sword practice. Lately, everyone has been worried about the appearance of demons. This made Leica feel an even greater sense of urgency. She couldn't sleep peacefully. But as for these creatures called demons, Leica had only ever seen them in library books. So, when news came that the demons had returned, she felt completely lost. Arthur was a little disappointed. It seemed the next generation was very neglectful when it came to studying demons. After all, the world had been at peace for so long, it seems they've grown too complacent. Just then, a desperate cry for help rang out. A young man, clutching an injured arm, staggered laboriously towards the city gate. The 2 of them hurried over. The young man was in a complete panic. "Please, help me. Demons appeared from the forest and attacked our carriage." Arthur's face immediately darkened. He wasn't even ready to deal with the demons yet, and here they were, already running rampant. The young man's carriage had been completely destroyed. The driver, his friend, and that old man were all in critical condition. Arthur and Leica immediately rushed out of the city with a few soldiers. The scene of the incident wasn't far from the city gate. The soldiers split up. Some rescued the injured, while others did a sweep of the area. Arthur looked around for a moment. The scene didn't look like a robbery at all. There were three-toed footprints all around, as well as fragments of crude weapons. "Sir, are you all right?" Leica asked worriedly, helping the old man up. It was clear he had just gone through a horrifying ordeal and was severely injured. "They're back," the old man gasped, barely able to breathe. "It was goblins. Goblins attacked us." The old man's words confirmed that Arthur's suspicions were correct. Meanwhile, the soldiers behind him didn't even know what a goblin was. The monsters had truly returned. They were originally foreign creatures from various races. However, the common trait among them was their extreme aggression, their willingness to attack anything, and being the primary threat to humanity. Just like the demon clan, they had been wiped out a long time ago, and now they too have returned. That night, after receiving dedicated medical care, the old man was finally doing a little better. Aside from the wound on his arm, there were no other life-threatening injuries. Arthur and Leica immediately went to question him. The old man was a merchant. While on his way back to the territory, goblins suddenly appeared and utterly routed them. They stole all the goods and then left. What's a goblin? Leica, a perfect example of the current generation, had no knowledge whatsoever about monsters. They are short, green-skinned monsters with pointed ears. But they disappeared along with the demon clan 50 years ago. This answer came not from the old man, but from Arthur. It seemed both Leica and the old man were surprised to see someone so young know so much about monsters. But that wasn't as important as why the monsters had reappeared and where they came from. Clearly, in that final battle, the Demon King had been defeated by the warrior and the other heroes. The creatures that threatened humanity had also been wiped out by them. The spatial corridor leading to the demon world had been sealed by the most powerful mages. Even the dragons were eradicated. That was how peace was restored. The hero, Sword Saint Ravenna, known as the Queen of the North Sea, she had been dispatched to the northern territories to rule. All the surviving monsters were kept under control there. They had ceased their hostility towards humans and lived in harmony and order with other species. However, the monsters have now broken the long-standing order in the north and have begun attacking humans again. This was all because Ravenna was also missing, a truly worrying development. "Sir, if you know about goblins, you must also know how to defeat them, right?" Leica continued to ask, but the old man didn't know. Because when he witnessed the war, he was just a child. The next morning, the entire town was once again shrouded in a gloomy atmosphere. All the townspeople had heard about the goblins. First, it was the archer Motorua, then the demon clan, and now, monsters. They were terrified that the era of peace had come to an end. Lord Ribeiro also hastily called a meeting with his vassals. However, their knowledge of the monsters was also very limited. Moreover, documents and books written about them were scarce. The Lord was at a dead end, unable to find anyone capable of fighting the monsters. The more Arthur thought about it, the stranger it felt. The heroes disappearing along with all information about monsters. This didn't seem like a coincidence at all. Goblins were originally the lowest-ranking race among monsters, yet now they were causing such a headache for humanity. They are very weak, but become difficult to handle when they move in packs. In an era where people lacked even the most basic knowledge about monsters, they were a threat to be concerned about. The whole town was on edge. Leica kept sighing, but Arthur didn't respond to her. He seemed to be deep in thought, and his pensive expression caught Leica's eye. That night, Arthur planned to sneak out of the castle. He wanted to find and deal with the goblins, but he was caught by Leica. "I knew you wouldn't just lie still. You're planning to sneak off and find those goblins, aren't you? Let me come with you." Honestly, Arthur didn't want to agree because it was too dangerous for a girl like Leica, who had never faced a monster before. Besides, if the Lord found out, Arthur would be strung up and beaten to death. But it was hard to stop someone as stubborn as Leica. She even showed Arthur a secret tunnel. The main gate was too heavily guarded for them to sneak out. Seeing how eager Leica was, Arthur couldn't bring himself to refuse her. Besides, this was a good opportunity for her to learn more about monsters. The two successfully snuck out of the castle, and Arthur led Leica to the site where the merchant's cart was attacked. If they followed the goblins' tracks, they could find their den. But little did Arthur know, while they were hunting for goblins, the goblins were secretly watching them. And among them was one goblin that was anything but ordinary. It could tell these humans were a cunning bunch. The two ran until they reached a swamp. Leica was panting from exhaustion. Goblins love damp places. It was no surprise they'd built their stronghold near this swamp. Leica didn't answer Arthur. She was still busy catching her breath. Suddenly, he pulled her down into a crouch, having spotted the goblin guards. This was the first time Leica had seen a goblin in the flesh, and she was tense. Arthur quickly drew his weapon. There was nothing to be afraid of. First, they had to take down the sentries, but the goblin guards were no match for Arthur. In just 2 moves, he took down 2 of them. He was a bit heavy-handed, but one of them was still breathing. And Arthur told Leica that she had to deliver the finishing blow. This was practical training, to get her used to the act of taking a life. Until now, Leica had only ever practiced swordsmanship for show. So, with an actual knife in her hand, she trembled uncontrollably. But in the end, under Arthur's piercing gaze, she had to finish the goblin off herself. The two ventured deeper into the goblin's den. Inside, the creatures were dividing up the food from their hunt. You see, these are goblins. They're frenzied, not very smart, and terrible at fighting. But they're aggressive, and become more dangerous when they gather in numbers. Oh, they're weaker than I thought. And this is the threat to our domain? We can't let them get away. Leica's composure was surprisingly stable. Arthur was pleased to see she remained so strong after killing a monster for the first time. Leica eagerly reached for her sword, but Arthur signaled for her to calm down. The goblins are about to go to sleep, and from what he knew, they'd go into their tents and not come out for the rest of the night. Goblins are famous for being incredibly deep sleepers. Even a clap of thunder right next to their ears wouldn't wake them. Hearing Arthur speak so knowledgeably, Leica grew even more curious. He knows so much. It's as if he's fought goblins before. She thought to herself that late at night, the goblins would go to sleep, leaving only a few on guard duty. Arthur quickly finished off the guards. The ones in the tents slept soundly, completely undisturbed. He swiftly cleared out 1 tent, 2 more to go. But just as Arthur was about to move to the second tent, his eyes landed on something. It was a house. It looked like the work of a human. Goblins were known to be savage and ignorant creatures. They don't have the skills to build a house, nor the intelligence to form a hierarchy. Frankly, they're just inferior creatures, driven by nothing but instinct. But seeing this, Arthur definitely sensed danger. He decided to change direction and attack here first. However, after just a few steps, Arthur stepped on something. Instantly, a trap sprang, and in that split second, he was genuinely panicked. Wait, since when did goblins know how to set traps? Leica was still waiting for him outside, but Arthur had been gone for quite a while, making her grow more and more impatient. However, Arthur had repeatedly told her to just sit still and wait here. Leica was always very obedient to her master, so she did as she was told. But just then, 3 goblins appeared. Somehow, they had discovered Leica. This wasn't like last time when Arthur asked her to finish off a goblin that was barely breathing. These were 3 perfectly healthy goblins, the real deal. Leica forced herself to calm down, then drew her sword. She was confident that with what Arthur had taught her, these 3 monsters were no match for her. However, the unthinkable happened right after. "Stand back, that's a human," a voice suddenly rang out. The 3 goblins stepped aside, and a long-haired goblin appeared. "This is a good opportunity to test my skills." Leica was immediately stunned. Why is this goblin so big? Moreover, it can even speak the human language. In contrast to her confusion, her opponent was incredibly calm. Leica could even sense that it was smiling. A supremely confident smile. "Come, human. You're a goblin?" Leica glared, sizing it up, expecting it to stay silent or reply with something like, "Why should I answer you?" However, the goblin replied calmly, "Correct. And I am their leader. Just like you, I am a warrior, trained in martial arts." The more Leica thought, the more confused she became. Didn't Arthur say that goblins were inferior creatures with no intelligence? Then how come this goblin looks almost human, can talk, and now even knows martial arts? Before she could think of an answer, the goblin twirled the spear in its hand, entering a battle stance. "Stop spacing out and attack. I will strike you down, human." What an arrogant goblin. Leica couldn't stand the thought of an inferior monster wanting to defeat her like this. She immediately charged forward with her sword, and her opponent rushed in without hesitation. Meanwhile, inside the goblin encampment, Arthur was severely injured. He failed to avoid the trap and had wounded his right arm, all because he had been careless. He really hadn't anticipated that the goblins would be smart enough to camouflage their trap with grass. But what was more concerning was that the commotion had woken up the entire horde. Now, they were all surrounding him, incredibly aggressive. Arthur pulled a long spear from his gauntlet. He stood in the middle of the encirclement, relentlessly attacking the monsters. However, the problem wasn't their strength, but their numbers. More and more monsters kept coming, leaving him unable to keep up. At the same time, Leica was still fiercely fighting the goblin leader. Her swordsmanship was quite good, but her opponent's strength was not to be underestimated. She grew even more irritated as her opponent kept judging her skills while they fought. How dare an inferior monster like you pass judgment on a human? Fueled by her anger, each of Lika's strikes grew more powerful. But for all her bravado, deep down, she was starting to panic. Because this goblin, it was effortlessly parrying her every blow. Not only that, the creature looked completely calm and confident. As Leka swung her sword once more, the goblin suddenly leaped high into the air, did a flip, and landed right behind her. You're putting too much force into your strikes. Your movements are unstable. It was humiliating to have her flaws pointed out by the enemy, but Leka felt a deeper sense of dread. For this creature to speak like that, it meant its skills were on par with Arthur's. She couldn't understand how a mere monster could possess such a profound understanding of swordsmanship. On top of that, she had a sinking feeling it wasn't even using a third of its true power. I'm certain that's not all you've got. Show me what else you can do, human. This time, Lika decided to use the Ravinia sword style. She approached her opponent with fluid, snake-like movements. But to her surprise, the goblin didn't even bother to dodge. It even cracked a smug grin. I see now. You're just a cheap imitation. Before Leka could even land her attack, her sword was shattered by the goblin's spear. Now, she was in real trouble. Not only was she disarmed, but the goblin's entire demeanor had changed. The look of excitement and calm was gone, replaced by pure killing intent. It's time to end this, human. The goblin raised its spear. It moved with such speed and force that Leka had no time to react, let alone dodge. Meanwhile, Arthur wasn't faring any better. He had managed to take care of the entire goblin horde, but he was severely injured in the process. More importantly, these goblins had a nasty habit of coating their weapons in poison, and now, the poison was taking effect, sapping all the strength from his body. He was even afraid that this was where he was going to die. As he tried to drag himself away, Arthur finally collapsed, unconscious. Leka, too, was on the brink of death. She had taken a direct hit from the goblin leader, but was lucky to be alive, saved only by a layer of hidden armor beneath her clothes. But now, the pain was so excruciating, she couldn't even move a muscle, and her opponent showed no signs of stopping. As it raised its weapon for the final blow, she was certain this was the end. A single, hot tear rolled down her cheek. Leka had given up all hope, but just then, a dagger came flying out of nowhere, knocking the spear from the goblin leader's grasp. Both the goblin and Leka were stunned. Her rescuer, in the nick of time, was none other than Arthur, though he was clearly struggling to stay on his feet. Oh? The excitement returned to the goblin leader's face. You've got some nerve, human. It was a miracle Arthur was even standing after being afflicted with so much poison. But judging by the state of them both, an incredibly difficult battle was about to unfold.